A big shout out to Marlon and Levon and all the people who've been organizing the Scion Exchange. You know, I went to my first Scion Exchange in 1985, I think, down when I lived in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And for years, I wanted to see it. Oh, hi, Lisa. For years, I wanted to see one happen around here. So it's really cool that the Permaculture Guild stepped up and is taking this on. Because they're great events. I love them. I love what the Guild does. So yeah, thanks for having me. So yeah, my name is Mark Dupont. I live at a place called Sandy Bar Ranch, and I work with the Mid-Klamath Watershed Council, which myself and several friends helped start back in 2000. And at that point, it was just a computer in a little corner in somebody's room. And it's grown and grown over the years, and now it's become quite a large organization. It's a nonprofit that does watershed restoration work in the Mid-Klamath. We're now the third largest employer in our area. We've got our staff rose to over 80 people this year. It's a big organization with a big sweep. This is one little component of what we do. And what I'm going to be talking about today is a project called Orchard Revitalization and Heirloom fruit of the Klamath region, the Mid-Klamath region and the Salmon Rivers. And that itself is a component of a food security, a 5-year food security project that the Mid-Klamath Watershed entered into in collaboration with the Karuk Tribe, Department of Natural Resources, the Salmon River Restoration Council, and UC Berkeley. That's the 4 partners that work specifically on this project. Our larger food security project was Klamath Basin-wide. It was a very exciting project to be involved in. It involved 3 Native American tribes throughout the whole basin, went on for 5 years. It had 45 objectives. Big, huge program, and a lot of really cool stuff came out of that. We're going to be honing in on what's particular to fruit trees today. And the idea being, well, first off, I guess I should say that everything that I'm going to talk about today is in a publication that's available for free. I have one display copy here, and I passed around a few display copies. I'm at the end of this 5-year program, and these are the publications that were a result of that. I just have display copies. I lost one copy earlier in this morning's presentation, so if anybody... Oh, it did? Great, thank you. Once again, they're all available for free at this website, mcwick.org. You go specifically to the Food Sheds page and you'll find it. And I'm going to flash this again at the end of the presentation. So if anything in here piques your interest, you know, have a look and download this for free. And if you can't find it, my address is on the board in the back of the room there, mark@mcwick, mkwc.org. If you can't find something and you're interested in more information, I'd be happy to get it to you. So that's just a picture of the website, and there's all kinds of information on the website about, there's farming garden calendars, there's information on soils, on vegetables, fruit, nut trees, pests, and there's a really good links page. So let's see, I am going to talk a lot about heirloom varieties today. So just to clarify what heirloom varieties are and what this project is about, is basically heirloom varieties are old varieties of fruit that predate industrial agriculture. And they're oftentimes uniquely adapted to a very specific soil and a climate. They have a huge, wide variation of qualities, flavors, sizes, and shapes. There at one point were 15 to 16,000 different apple varieties in North America alone. Huge number of apple varieties. We've lost over 80% of those. Most of those are now gone due to the homogenization of industrial agriculture.
What percentage is gone?
We started 15 to 16,000, we're down to about 3,000 now, about 80%.
Wow.
So, maybe actually, there's your number there. I actually might have confused it with this one. 80% of the remaining 3,000 are what's called endangered. And that means that we're down to 1 to 3 nurseries that carry those varieties. So we've already lost the majority of our varieties. The ones that are remaining, we're going to lose unless we begin to conserve them. What they've been replaced with is unfortunately the Red Deliciouses of the world. You know, the Fuji's. Fuji's a good apple. It's not in Red Delicious. I don't put it quite in that category. But they've been replaced with kind of tasteless apples that have pretty cosmetics and they store and ship well. And we're just losing a huge amount as far as our palate goes. What we're also losing are all these varieties that are biologically, or I should say bioregionally adapted to specific places. So an heirloom fruit tree tends to be a fruit tree that has been out on the landscape for a long time. There is no set time, but I would say an heirloom fruit tree tends to be 50 to 100 years old. Now, you've probably all stumbled upon old fruit trees at one time or another, maybe in a really incongruous situation, like when you're out hiking and you think you're in a wild area and you find a fruit tree. Some of these old fruit trees that have been on abandoned orchards, or maybe even our volunteers, but mostly the ones that are on old homesteads, out in our area, they're on old mining claims. A lot of them are on these home sites where the home is long gone, but the trees continue. A lot of these guys have been cranking out good quality fruit for 10, 20, 30, 50, 60, 70 years in the same place with no fertilizer, with no water, no pruning, no care of any kind. So that represents something that's really uniquely adapted to that specific area. So it's really important for our food security future. And it's also a really big part of our past, because each of these trees has a story that goes with it. And it's amazing, and I'll show you at the end of this presentation, I'll just give you a little sampling of some of the stories that we discovered from all these different fruit trees that we were finding and identifying and preserving. So that was the objective of this 5-year program, was to go out on the landscape, find where these trees are, map them, describe them, and start to propagate them, but also teach other people and get the community involved in that process. So that's what this whole story is going to be about. So we dubbed the whole process orchard revitalization because people recognized there was all these old orchards that had been abandoned that weren't being utilized anymore. So I define this whole process of what orchard revitalization is, and it goes throughout the year. And it starts in the summer, fall with exploring old orchards and identifying the promising varieties and mapping and identifying them and placing tags on them. And if you want to get into this and try it yourself, it's really important to start identifying trees with metal markers, because you might think you can remember what trees exist where. But the more trees you add into that mental library you have, the harder it is to keep track of. Winter is a really good time for restoration pruning. A lot of these trees are old trees that haven't been cared for years. They're overgrown bird's nests and they need to be brought back. And that process, you don't want to do it too drastically. It's a several year process. Talk a little bit about that. When the next summer, fall rolls around, keep monitoring, increase your fruit exploration. Make sure you make field notes. The following winter, if you've done some restoration pruning on old trees that you want to propagate, that's great, because the following year is when they're going to push and make this nice scion wood. People have been here collecting scion today. That nice, straight, sleek wood that you get is a product of pruning a tree. These old withered trees don't have a lot of good growth on them, and they're going to be really difficult to collect scion wood from. Early spring is time to bark graft onto mature trees. I'll give a slide. I'll show a few slides about that process, and we gave a workshop about it earlier for those who were here. And then you just continue it. We started this particular program 5 years ago, and it's still going strong. People are out now every year, finding new trees, collecting scion wood, and propagating. So really, it goes on and on. It gets pretty addictive. So. If you want to get into this yourself, as I said, the publication I put together is more of a how-to manual. It's not so much a report as like how to go about doing it. You don't need much. You just need some friends to help you out and find some varieties and taste test them together. Because if you're going to get involved in taste testing and cataloging, which is what we did, it really helps to have different palettes to bounce, impressions off of, because different people have different takes on fruit, and really it takes like 3 or 4 people to evaluate fruit. And we did a lot of this, and we got a lot of belly aches going out into these old orchards. It was really fun, and collecting these old varieties and sitting around and slicing them and passing them around and talking about them. Bear in mind that a lot of these guys are diamonds in the rough. On these old trees, they're not necessarily going to look like these pretty apples that you find in the store, So you got to be able to kind of recognize the potential. I'll probably talk a little bit more about that later. The only other thing that you might want to have is a pair of these long-reach pruners. A lot of these old trees, the fruit's way up high and you can barely reach it. And this is a photo of Ben Saxon and Heather from the Karuk tribe. So right there, Ben's knocking a pear out of this tree and Heather's catching it. So long-reach pruners are really, really handy if you want to do some fruit exploring. Next, we started mapping the orchards. We've got pages and pages of logs and maps. And as I said, when you start finding trees you like, it's really a good idea to tag them. And use an aluminum tag, put a really clear name on it, hang it on there with a good, don't use a little skinny wire they give you with the tags. Use a heavier gauge fence wire so that it hangs on there. It'll stay there for years, What we did in our partnership with the Karuk tribe is that the Karuk tribe Department of Natural Resources hired what they call food crews. And for the last 5 years, and now continuing, they've worked in food security issues in the community, doing different activities at different times of the year. And where they worked in the winter was out in these old orchards, restoring them. So the tribes did a lot of work clearing around these old trees. These are the old trees here, you can see from an old homestead on Lower Red Cap Road. So they spent a lot of time clearing, piling, burning the brush, and then restoring the old trees through pruning. Restoration pruning, as I mentioned, it's something, if you've got an old tree, you don't want to try to bring that tree back all at once. It takes, you want to plan on spending about 3, maybe up to 5 years to restore an old tree that's really neglected. And the best resource I know about this is this one here, Pruning to Restore an Old Neglected Apple Tree, and it's listed in the publication. And it's also listed on the website, and I give you a direct link to it. It's a fantastic pruning booklet. Not many pruning booklets are useful, I found. This one was Stebbins, R.L. Stebbins. He was a pomologist that's been around. He's written a lot of great books. Worked in both California and Oregon. Really knows his stuff. And he really did a very logical, super useful, short little brochure that I use it all the time, and I give it out in my classes. So check this one out if you have old trees that you need restored. Just about everybody does, it seems. So we spent our summer and fall out exploring trees and finding them, sitting around, tasting them, taking pictures of them, cataloging them, and talking to elders mostly. The elders were really where we got most of our information about this. They would say, oh yeah, well, down at this particular swimming hole, I remember, every year when we'd swim, there would be such and such an apple ripe nearby, and that was my favorite apple. I've got a little story about the swimmer apple at the end of this. And as I say, the stories behind them are just incredible. But you got to get out there, and at first, don't worry about names. Everybody wants to know what named fruit is. And ultimately, especially when you're doing a project like this, you want to try to find out what's out there. If you start to find named varieties, which you will, and we do out there, like Gravenstein, Bellflower, there's certain apples that are California heirlooms that are still being sold and are still commercially available. They're not going to float to the top of your priority list. So you want to try to name apples when you can, but you don't want to try to get hung up on it. Sometimes I've seen people get it hung up and they don't want to start propagating or dealing with an apple until they know what it is. My approach is like, if you know of apples, if you know of old apple trees that have really good useful varieties that people like start to reproduce them. You'll figure out what the name is, and you may figure out that it is indeed an old heirloom that predates all the modern varieties and doesn't even exist anymore. You might find out that it actually matches up with a variety that's an heirloom that's still commercially available. But still, it's worth identifying and collecting. When it comes to some of these old varieties like Golden Delicious, that's a really interesting variety. Golden Delicious is still out, and there's very modern varieties of Golden Delicious in the store. Well, the old heritage Golden Delicious are way, way better. They're far better, and there's a real broad spread. There's lots of what's called sports and variation. So when you find old Golden Delicious on these old homesteads, they're really worth keeping, even though there's new modern versions of Golden Delicious available. So what we do is spend a lot of time getting out there, finding things. If we don't have a name, we make a number. If you want to make up a name, or if the people that steered you to it have a name, make up a name. It doesn't matter. Don't get hung up on the name. I developed these forms for evaluating, and this is where it gets really fun, because when you have to describe a fruit, if you're going to write down an evaluation, if you're going to describe it, for the purpose of cataloging, you really do want to be specific. And when you get into it, you find out that there's all these very specific names when it comes to pomology. So this is all these different names just describing the shape of an apple. So what I did was I put them onto the form, and rather than having to remember all these, you just circle it. And, you know, once you put together all these different characteristics of an apple, you start to see different details. There's different shapes, there's different profiles. So this is a profile if you cut it long ways. This is a profile if you cut it crossways. Does the apple have stars on it, which means little spots? Actually, stars are stars. They're little flecks. Spots are a little spot that's got a circle around it. Some apples have spots, some have stars. Some apples have russet. If you look at the stem end of an apple, that little brown that you see around the stem end is the russet. So you'll start to look at apples in different ways when you start using these forms, and all these different details will jump out at you, and they're all really important. Russet is super important because it adds tremendously to the quality of an apple. Old cider varieties are largely russeted because the russet really adds more to the tannins and the acids, and it creates a much more complex flavor. And russets are not cosmetically desirable, so a lot of the russet's been bred out. So we've lost that really good quality particularly for cider apples and for dessert apples. So when winter rolls around again, and you've already done your first pruning, you can go out and collect your scion wood. That's what you do right now. Hopefully, you're gonna have nice, long, straight scion wood, but not always, you know? Every once in a while, you identify, and this happened with us, you identify an old heirloom variety that's just about to die. I mean, maybe a big fir tree is gonna fall on it, maybe it's on its last legs, and you have to propagate it. So collect what you can and use what you got. In this case, here's like an Arkansas black that I actually took from an orchard tree. And here's this little pie cherry called Know Nothing Pie Cherry. When we started this project, a few varieties jumped out at us, and one of them was the Know Nothing Pie Cherry. There's a Know Nothing Creek on the Salmon River, and apparently there was a pie cherry there that everybody knew about. And every time I told somebody about this project, they're like, you got to get the Know Nothing cherry, right? So, and two women, Karuna Greenberg and Lyra Cressy, I have to credit them. They live on the Salmon River and have lived on the Salmon River for years, and they know the Salmon River inside out. It's amazing what's in their brains. How many fruit trees they are intimately familiar with is incredible. And they knew this Know Nothing Pie Cherry. But they brought me these sticks that were pathetic, really. I mean, they were like barely there. And I'll show you how we propagated those. If you end up with that situation, there's a way you can save those. And not, because indeed that this tree did die the next year. So it was our last chance to propagate it. So once you gather your scion wood, you can do what's called bench grafting. And is Jed still here?
Yeah.
Jed, too bad. Jed did the bench grafting talk today, which is also called whip grafting. So that's when you purchase rootstock like they have available here, you stand at a bench and you do whip grafting. The advantage of this approach is you end up with lots of little trees that you can then distribute. So we had workshops, ongoing workshops, and these are people from, that's Karuna from SRRC, and that's Ron Reed, and that's Ben Saxon, and this is Noreen. Basically, people from SRC and DNR, we got together and we just grafted in the wintertime. We just grafted like fiends, and we bought pots and potting soil and grafted them up. It's really cool to see who shows up to help grafting. This was Ruby, who's a crude basket maker. And she showed up one day and said, I want to graft. I want to help out with this. I think it's cool. And I was like, okay, great. Well, you know, you never know. Sometimes it takes a long time to figure out how to graft. Well, she's a basket maker. And she works with knives. And she collects willow all the time. So I showed her once. And this was the first graft that she did. Basically, she nailed it. She just, this is a whip graft. I don't know if you can see that, but that's a close-up of a whip graft. And that's Ruby's first whip graft that she ever did. It took me 100 grafts to get to that point. So, you know, you never know. It's really fun doing these workshops because some people just really pick it up. Grafting also is not a hard skill. You just have to have a good sharp knife and the right kind of knife, and you just work at it. It's just practice. So we started propagating, and we had 2 nurseries for our project. Actually, 3 nurseries. These were 2 community nurseries. This was a nursery we set up at Sandy Bar Ranch, and that's Ben Saxon from the Karuk tribe tending them. Ben took them on. And this is Lyra Cressy and Karuna Greenberg from Salmon River Restoration Council, who had their own nursery up there. So we had a couple of community nurseries, and we contracted with Rolling River Nursery. I don't know if any of you know Mark Roby and Karina, who are up there, but they've got Rolling River Nursery, and Mark's an amazing wealth of information. At the very end of our 5-year projects, we still had more to do and some really rare special ones, and we contracted Mark. So he did some, produced some trees for us. And we ended up producing about over 700 trees during the project that are now out there and getting planted in communities and getting utilized. We did the, when spring rolls around, you get past bench grafting season, and into March, you can start doing bark grafting. Again, I gave a little demonstration on this earlier. This is one of my favorite grafts. It's a super simple graft you can do. When you have a tree and you're not happy with it, and you want to change the variety over, don't yank it out, you can top graft it, you can top work it. It's a great technique. By top working a tree instead of pulling it out, you can completely replace the variety. You can put several varieties on the same tree if you want. And if you pull out a tree, if you cut it down and you dig up the root, it's a lot of work. You're gonna have to plant another tree. 5 years, you're gonna start getting fruit. If you top work a tree and bench graft it, then 2 years, you're gonna have a canopy. Replace it and you'll be getting fruit from it again. So it's way easier. You can mix it up. I showed people how to combine and put different varieties on one tree. If you got a big mature tree, you can put lots of varieties on it. I've got an apple at home. It's got 17 different apple varieties on it. You can mix and match, and you can put different things together if you want. This is Ben and Noreen doing bench top working field grafting in the Orleans Community Garden. So we had these seedling peach trees. This is a great technique if you've got fruit trees that are seedlings that are volunteer. Again, rather than pulling them up, you can top work them. Somebody had given them to the garden. They never bore any fruit. They were seedlings. So again, rather than pull them out, we top worked them. And the advantage to this is you get a huge push of vegetative growth when these trees are in the ground, even from a small tree like this. This is the grafting that we did in March, and that's Noreen by the same, these are the same 2 trees in August, the following August. So you can see that whole canopy shot up and replaced. And that's pretty typical with grafting wood. So we applied this at the community garden, but we also went out into the field, into these old abandoned orchards, and where we found volunteer trees, we didn't pull them out, we top worked them. So there's a picture of a volunteer tree one year. It's kind of dim here, but that's it, top work. And that's the tree the next year, the following year. This is Ben. You can barely see this, but Ben is out in the field standing next to some grass. And Ben's, 5'8" or 9" or so. These trees, these grafts that we grafted right there last year, they're shooting up well over 8 feet tall. So it's a really good way to get some quick growth really quickly. It is also a really good way to save that spindly scion wood you might end up with. If you end up with old trees and you're trying to save them and you think they might die, the scion wood you're going to get off of those trees, if they haven't been pruned, is going to be really tiny and spindly. This is the wood that was brought to me for the Know Nothing cherry. And not only was it tiny and spindly, it was also starting to bloom, which makes it really, really hard to craft. But I top worked it onto a cherry I had, and sure enough, it took. So if you've got this little tiny spindly wood, this bark graft, you can use that to save the variety, get a lot of vegetative wood. The next year, you're going to have a ton of grafting wood from it. So it's a really good way to save a variety and to create more propagation stock from it. And we did a bunch of community workshops as well throughout the whole process, because the idea, we trained some technicians that were working with NGOs, but we also focused on getting the skills out into the community. So we did a series. This is Jeremy Dahl, who's an arborist up in Orleans, teaching folks how to graft. And we did a bunch of pruning workshops at old orchards throughout the Klamath River, Orleans area and Sumsbar area. We worked up in Happy Camp. Our program also bought a juicer. We tried to focus and buy in a few pieces of equipment that were important to food security, and one of them was a juicer. It's like everybody would love to have a juicer, but they're not cheap. And you only use it once or twice a year, so we bought a community press, which has been super popular. And it rotates around the community. Last year, I stuck it on the back of this flatbed, and I drove up to Karuk housing when the apples were getting ripe, and the kids all came out with buckets of apples, and all we had to do was show them how to juice, and then they took over. This is the kids doing. They did all the juicing. I literally got them started. They love it. Kids go crazy over juicing. So this is a really cool little juicer I can refer you to. It's a family. I can't remember the name of it. It's an Oregon family that produces them. They're really high quality. This particular one has an electric grinder, which is really nice if you're going to produce a lot of juice. But it's a hand crank press. It's a great way to produce a lot of juice. And you guys have all seen it. Apples fall and rot everywhere, right? It's a really good way to utilize a lot of apples real quickly. And we did heirloom fruit tastings, which again, people really love. You do a community heirloom fruit tasting, and folks show up with more and more information, and this thing just starts to kind of balloon, because as soon as people show up and they start tasting them, they're like, oh, that reminds me of this, or you got to go check out this old homestead, or you got to, I want to bring you to my family site because I've got my favorite apples, and, I wanted to reproduce them. So community, maybe that could be a next little thing for the Permaculture Guild, the fruit tasting. I saw there was some fruit out there today, which was really cool. And when we started having trees that were ready to plant in the ground, we got the school kids involved in planting around the community. This is the planting at the community garden. So we cataloged a bunch of heirloom fruit varieties. This is just a sample of them. They're in this publication. We ended up cataloging 59 heirloom varieties that we were able to photograph and taste test and describe. And we're not done yet. We kind of just scratched the surface. Again, if you do look at this and download it, if you look at some of these fruits, you'll see, again, they're not perfect looking fruit. They have blemishes, some of them might have scab. You got to realize and be able to kind of parse out and see the diamond in the rough. Some of them are still, you cut into them and taste them, and they're amazing flavor. Or some of them, they're just promising. And you think, well, we should propagate this, get it into an orchard, give it some love, and see what happens then, Some of them you find actually have no blemishes. They're really valuable. If something's got no scab on it, or you find a peach that has no peach leaf curl, they're disease-resistant varieties, so they're particularly important to preserve. So I'm just going to wrap up with just a couple of particular varieties that we found, and give time for questions if you want. This one was that swimmer apple that I was telling you about. This was a really cool variety. I loved it. There's a woman named Jessie Allen, who is the postmistress up at Forks of Salmon, their little tiny post office there. And she loves her apples, and they've been in her family for quite a while. And apparently, let me see if I get this straight. Yeah, here it is. Jessie's grandmother was born in 1898. And she used to do laundry for the miners, the gold miners up there. And she saved her pennies. And she used all of her money to buy fruit trees as a girl, and planted fruit trees up and down the river. And they figure she probably ordered her fruit trees from the Sears and Roebuck catalog. I have not yet made it back to old Sears and Roebuck catalogs to try to retrace some of these varieties, but that's homework that I still have to do. Jessie, her granddaughter, still knows all these. And she came to us with 5 or 10 varieties to save. And one of her favorite that she insisted was this swimmer apple. And they're called swimmer because all little kids, when they were done their chores and they're allowed off in the afternoon, would run down to the swim hole, and they'd pick a bunch of fruit off of this tree, and they'd throw it in the river, and then they'd swim around for a few minutes, and then they'd all swim down river, and whoever could catch the most apples with their mouth won. So this was a swimmer apple. So it's got this great story behind it that she grew up with. It's also a phenomenal apple. I mean, she really likes this apple, and the tree is old, and she really wanted to replace it. The sheep's nose was this other apple. I don't know if any of you know Bill Tripp, but he is the ecocultural advisor and he leads the ecocultural program of the Karuk tribe, and he's an amazing person. He's incredible wealth of knowledge, and his family, of course, has been up there forever, the Tripp family. He kept telling me about this one apple. Well, he actually had several apples on his ranch, and they had lost. It was too late. We lost a few of them. But this sheep's nose was one we were able to save, and this sheep's nose traces its origin back to the Hudson Trading Company, which is pre-gold mine era. I know that. The gold mining started in 1851, 1850 out there. I believe it was the 1820s when the Hudson Company was trapping up in our area. And his family allowed them to trap on their land in exchange in a trade. And part of what they got were these fruit trees. And the last of those fruit trees are still surviving on their ranch. So we were able to get in there. And sure enough, sheep's nose is this old variety of apple that's really oblong. And if you turn it over, it's got these dimples down on the bottom, so it does look a little bit like a critter nose. But he loves these apples, and we were able to propagate these and save them. Sagasar fig, there was a family called Sagasar that had developed a mining claim up on the Klamath River, which is now vacant. Nobody lives there, but there's just tons of fruit trees. You wouldn't believe how many fruit trees are still surviving there. So our list of Sagasar fruit trees is seriously, we must have 15, 20 varieties from just this one site. There's so many different fruit varieties there. I just pulled this one out because I thought it was an interesting story. So this particular fig, which for one thing, it is interesting to find a fig still producing. It's common to find apples. It's common to find some quince and pears. You start getting into peach, and that's really unusual to find old peach trees that last that long. And figs, because figs tend to dry up and their fruit doesn't fill out without irrigation. And this one is still producing good figs with no irrigation. So there's something there, it's worth saving. But the story of this, let's see, Diane Wixon's grandfather, who was a whaling captain in the late 1800s, settled here on the river and sent for his sweetheart in the Azores. That's the islands off of Africa. to come join him, she brought along a cutting from the Isle of Flores. It's still growing up there in the Salmon River, you know. So all of these fruit trees out there in the landscape, if there's these old heirloom fruit trees, I can rest assured most of them have pretty amazing stories to them, you know. They're all intertwined with family. When it gets into what was really kind of amazing about this project is it definitely interweaved with a really difficult and tragic past that happens out there. It was not happy when the miners arrived out to our area for the Karuk tribe. It was a bit of an apocalypse, really. But there was a commingling there, and you know the Karuk family still considered these, even though they came from another place, they're still their varieties. You know, they co-married. It's become a story that's part of the land and part of the landscape. So, you know, a lot of Karuk tribal members were really excited about identifying and propagating and saving these. So again, I think they're really important, not just for kind of food security in the future, but they really tell a story about the past that I think is really rich. We ended up in the end restoring 165 different heirloom trees we were able to identify. We trained 12 technicians that are out there grafting and pruning fruit trees. We cataloged 59 varieties. We were able to produce over 700 trees, and we had 365 people attend workshops, which was not bad in these smaller rural areas. So once again, this book, if you're interested in any more information, that's the website where you can download a free copy, and that's my email. If you have any questions or anything, or wanting more resources about grafting or fruit exploring, let me know. I'd be happy to answer questions. Thanks a lot.
We have a lot of bear damage right now out
Yep.
inland. And a lot of the trees, there's just a little left of them. And is it possible to graft back onto a rootstock that's still pretty healthy from the same tree that might just have a few?
They're on the same site?
Yeah.
You can do that, but realize that those old bear trees, they get on the bears' maps. Bears know. If you get an old tree with lots of claw marks in it and broken branches, and it's obviously on a bear's map, that bear will always remember that, and it'll bring its cubs back to it. So that's a reality. I caution people about putting fences up across paths like that, because if a bear...
We didn't have that for like 35 years. We didn't have this.
Oh, so how long has it been going on?
It's been going on for about 5 years.
Okay,
with
so
all the fires and
all
everything.
right. Well, you got time. If that's something, then you still have time. And the only thing is a combination of good, strong fences and dogs.
Yeah.
Either one won't usually do it on its own. Although dogs are pretty darn good, just to keep them away. But the longer that's on that bear's map, the more cubs it's going to show, and the more it's going to be. So I would be cautious about, about. But yes, to answer your question, aside from the bear damage, absolutely, you can take volunteer trees anywhere and graft right onto them.
Can you graft the same stuff, the same branches coming off that tree
sure can.
on that same tree?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah. No reason why you can't do that.
I've been working on this property that has a bunch of the original Eder apples.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Out in Edinburgh?
Yeah, and the new landowners don't really know anything about the trees, but I asked them recently if they tasted them, and they were like, yeah, they all taste terrible. So, well, they might actually taste, I don't disbelieve them, they're like, smart people and stuff, but like, could they just taste terrible because they haven't been cared for, or could they be root stuff? Like, what do you
Couple of thoughts there.
And is it worth pursuing?
I lived on a farm in the Santa Cruz Mountains that had 45 different varieties of apples, and I used to sell the apples and taste test them. On more than one occasion, I would be taste testing, and somebody would put an old heirloom variety into their mouth and spit it out. Our palates had become really wimpy. And old heirloom fruit trees, they can be tannic, they can be bitter, they can be acidic, but that's all character. They've all got a specific place and a different specific use. So for one thing, try them out and open up your palate, you know, taste them for yourself. So what is terrible to them might be that they're used to eating Golden Delicious off of the shelf, and they're not used to how an apple should really taste. The other thing is you got to talk to Ram Fishman. You know him? Ram Fishman has Green Mantle Nursery, and he's in Eddersburg, and he knows more about old Edder varieties than anybody, and he's cataloged them. And he's got a beautiful catalog. What's that?
He has it all on his
I haven't looked at the website lately, so look up Green Mantle and Ram Fishman and talk to Ram. Because he would have enough knowledge to know whether there's some specific trees there that you should, like, he would take out a lot of your homework for you. He would be like, he probably knows the site, he probably knows the varieties, he could probably be like, you better save X, Y, and Z trees.
Also Betty Edder.
Yes, Betty. Betty too.
Much.
Yeah, she's the Edder family. Okay.
I was just going to say that there's a strong likelihood that there's a number of different varieties within those trees because they didn't usually plant just one kind of
Oh,
Edder.
no.
The Edders have developed a lot of different.
Hopefully everybody knows that Albert Edder was an amazing plant breeder in Humboldt County. Humboldt County's own plant breeder that bred strawberries, chestnuts, and apples.
And roses.
So he gave us the pink pearl, the Waltana. He gave us several varieties of chestnuts, you know. And if you check out Green Mantle Nursery, they've got them all cataloged. It's very cool. Yeah.
Our partner and I caretake a property on the Lower Klamath with the 30 fruit trees. We just finished a 5-year project to bring them down.
Oh, cool. Great.
I'm a little concerned that it's too much bringing them down. What can we expect next year and over the following years?
So for 5 years, you've been pruning it?
There was other caretakers that did it for 3 years.
Yeah.
We've done it for 2 years.
Yeah.
The big cuts.
Yeah.
And so we're just really hoping to restore the fruit trees because they were in terrible shape.
Yep. So I'd have to look at it to really answer that question. If they were pruned severely last year, apples bear on spurs, which take 1 to 2 or 3 years to develop. And then once they start developing those spurs will produce and live for up to 25 years. So when you cut back really hard, you tend to remove a bunch of those spurs and it takes a few years to replace them. So depending on how severely they were pruned in the previous year, you should start to see some spur development and more fruiting in the coming years. You may see some fruit this year. I'd have to see it to know.
And just of interest, we have a Grafting that was planted in 1930.
Yeah.
It has since toppled over, but has become 5 different Grafting trees from
Yep.
the same old.
Cool. Yeah, Grafting seed's another one of those old varieties. There's lots of different varieties. It's a variety, but there's lots of different strains of it. And I always keep my eye out for those old strains. The old strains tend to be striped and not as solid red. So, anybody else? Cool, great. Well, hey, thanks for everybody. Appreciate it.